أستغفر الله أستغفر الله أستغفر الله الله.
Skin. And skin is a very nice place to start because it has a lot of the essential building blocks of tissues as well. And in this case, we're going to take thin skin rather than thick skin. In thin skin, this stratum corneum here, which is keratinized or cornified material, is thinner than the rest of the full thickness of the epidermis, and that's why it's called thin skin. Generally, thin skin is as thick or as thin as it has to be. So in areas where you need more protection, like your soles and palms, it's thicker skin, and therefore the stratum corneum is thicker than the rest of the epidermis. Let's go through the different layers of the epidermis, which is the epithelial portion, the dermis, which is chiefly this connective tissue portion, and what they call the hypodermis or subcutis, which is largely a fat, perhaps loose connective tissue, if you will. Even though we're going to go from top to bottom, classically, when you look at the epidermis itself as the first third of the project, you usually start from the base and go towards the top. And in the skin, the epithelium is keratinized and it's stratified. The reason why it's stratified is because you need multiple protective layers. And the general principle is towards the base of the epidermis, where you see this vague thing called the basement membrane delineating the epidermis from the connective tissue of the dermis, the cells are basically aligned in a cuboidal fashion. Towards the middle of the layering, they are generally about as wide as they are long, or therefore they are cuboidal. And certainly at the top, they are very, very flat or squamous. And multi-layered or stratified epithelium is always called by the uppermost layer. So this is stratified squamous, even though the more basal cells or the deeper cells are not technically squamous. And of course, lastly, there's a layer in which you have keratinized material, but there is no nucleus in it whatsoever. That's a stratum corneum. So once again, thin skin, stratum corneum is generally no thicker than the rest of the epidermis. The columnar cells oriented at the base are what we call basal cells. In some of the books they call these the stratum germinativum, or perhaps the there's another name for it which kind of escapes my mind, so I'm not going to mention it. Most of the cells above the basal layer are cuboidal, and they have little spaces between them, and in these spaces, if you were to put this on high power, you would see tiny little step ladders in these spaces, like they are prickly. That's why this is often called the prickle cell layer or prickle cells, but for the most part it's called the stratum spongiosum because they're also spongy. Towards the top, you can get cells often, and sometimes in some areas more than others, in which you can see granules of keratohyalin. So that's called the stratum granulosum. And in addition, in some areas of the body, but not this one, there will be a very clear zone, approximately like this, called the stratum lucidum, because it's very clear, before you get into the stratum corneum. So here's a stratum corneum. This might be a good case for a stratum lucidum, which is very thin and lucid or clear looking. Here is the stratum spinosum. And if I said spongiosum before, that's just my Alzheimer's kicking in. And here we have at the base the cells oriented in a columnar fashion, the basal cells, or stratum germinativum. And often interspersed in the basal layer but also sometimes a little bit higher, will be cells which you could see have these very, very fine little granules in them. And these are melanocytes. And technically, they are not exactly derived from the same area that the rest of these squamous cells or epidermal cells are. Right underneath that, you have looser connective tissue which interweaves with the sinusoidal fashion of the lower epidermis. This is called the papillary dermis because it has a papillary or finger-like configuration. Denser connective tissue below that, which is very rich in elastic fibers, is the reticular dermis. In the reticular dermis and in the papillary dermis, you may see skin appendages, which is defined as hair follicles or sweat glands, which we'll see later. And then last but not least, let's go down a little bit through this much considerably thicker reticular dermis to get into an area that's very loose connective tissue and chiefly in fat, and this is technically the hypodermis or subcutaneous fat, or some people call it the subcutis. So going backwards, we have the hypodermis, loose fatty connective tissue, the reticular dermis, which is the denser, more thicker collagen bundles arranged every which way because the skin is subject to forces in every direction. Then we have between the rete pegs or the projections of the epidermis, the papillary dermis, because they look like papillary projections. Then we have the various layers of the epidermis, and then because the stratum corneum is thinner generally than the rest of the epidermis, this is called thin skin. Here is a blood vessel, probably an arteriole. Here is a little nerve, and here is a duct from a skin appendage, most certainly a sweat gland, because I don't really see any hair follicles in here at all. So that is a duct of a sweat gland. Here's a blood vessel, here's a blood vessel, here's a thicker blood vessel, probably an artery. Here's just fat, there's a small blood vessel. There's a nerve, and you could probably recognize it better now. Nerve, blood vessel, nerve, dense collagen bundles of the reticular dermis, and let's see if we could find some more skin appendages here. Perhaps if we look here, we could see small acinar or tubular structures which have a very small lumen, and you can see above them are these little ducts leading up ultimately towards the epidermis to result in what we call pores. These are the eccrine sweat glands, E-C-C-R-I-N-E. They are arranged in these little clusters. They're very characteristic, look like this. They're different from the larger, wider spaces we'll see in the apocrine sweat glands. And the characteristic feature about them is they have a relatively clear cytoplasm. The ducts which lead into these are a little bit darker, and they are a double layer of cuboidal epithelium. And we could see some acini here. We could see a duct here, a duct here, a duct here, probably here, and the rest of these are acini. And last but not least, in the the eccrine sweat glands, which we're dealing with now, there are these little spindly cells towards the periphery, and sometimes if you cut the gland tangentially, like we have here, you can see little cytoplasmic processes extend from them. These are myoepithelial cells. These are the contractile cells which assist in the expression of sweat from the eccrine sweat gland. Is there anything else we want to talk about in this? I'm sure for my first slide I went way over my 3-minute promise. You could tell this is a large blood vessel, a large artery. You could tell the rest of this is fat. Here's a little bit of loose connective tissue as part of that fat. So if you would like to call the subcutis or hypodermis perhaps loose connective tissue rather than fat, be my guest. Here is a nerve, here is a nerve, here is a nerve, and there's a large artery. Let's verify that. Yes, this is all looks classically like nerve, chiefly axon surrounded by Schwann cells. Some more over here. Here's a large artery, probably 7 or 8 layers of smooth muscle. There's your internal elastic lamina. There's probably a small artery. That's probably either an arteriole or a vein. It's hard to say. That's a small blood vessel. Here's a vein. I'm sorry. Here's a vein. Here's an artery. And here's a nerve. And you know what? I don't really think I want to say anything more, but I want to tell you we're going to have a lot of fun in the series of shotgun histology. Thank you very much.
هاتنا واللي كفا ولنعاود من قريب ولنعد للنور صفا عهد ماضينا الأريب يا عسى الرحمن يهدي كل صبار منيب ويعيد الحب يندي بالهدى قلب الحبيب يا عسى الرحمن يهدي كل صبار